3rd edition Dungeon Master's Guide has a section in it, a very brief one, titled Metagame Thinking. That tiny section, about 3 paragraphs, would eventually label the phenomenon that we now refer to as metagaming, in which players utilize knowledge that their characters don't necessarily have. That is a kind of ideological battlefield in the society of gamers. In that same area of the book, there's also a section on immersion. It discusses how into the world of the game the players should be during the process of playing. Metagaming, obviously, is a escape from that. When people are metagaming, they are being pulled out of the in-game immersion experience because they are thinking in real-world terms which they are imposing on the game's secondary world, which that game's secondary world doesn't actually have. One of the reasons why it is difficult to have this kind of conversation despite the vilification of metagaming is that one of the aspects of metagaming that is most important for us to consider are the rules themselves. As is often brought up, your character doesn't know what level they are, right? They don't know how many hit points they have. It's not how they think. It's just how we interpret their world quantitatively for our purposes. I'm streaming this. Hello, Matt. Thank you for bringing that to my attention. This is meant to be a recording. I said I wanted to do a video about the Duskblade. The reason, though, is surprisingly difficult to explain in only 7 minutes or so. The Duskblade existed because of a certain characteristic in the 3rd edition rules for Dungeons & Dragons. Essentially, what would become known as arcane spellcasters were supposed to be designed with the thought of what their position was in the world to not be able to deal in melee combat. And anybody that would cast arcane spells that was working in melee combat had to be doing so in extremely special circumstances that made playing those characters disadvantageous to an extreme. As an example of this, I had a 3rd edition character that was a multi-classed fighter wizard that was in the same party as a 3rd edition cleric. And that very much showed the clerics were just on paper superior in a number of ways than trying to figure out how to do something like this. And that was well known, and so too was well known the fact that there were people that wanted to make characters that were capable of that, which is where the Gish came from. The Gish was originally a mispronunciation of Gith that is part of an in-house story for the design. They started referring to people that would cast spells in melee as being like the Gith or Gish because they couldn't remember which pronunciation was correct. And now it is actually in universe that the Gish are the knights of the Githyanki. I don't think I made that up. I'm pretty sure that's a thing. Anyhow, so the Duskblade came out in Player's Handbook 2 for Dungeons & Dragons 3.5 as a way of showing the extreme leap that had happened between the mindsets of 3.0's spellcasting, specifically the arcane ones, and what people had been wanting from a lot of these characters. It didn't change the fact that a multi-classed fighter wizard was kind of bad. It just meant that you could take those levels in this class instead to get what you wanted. But the Duskblade only could exist within that system because of the system's own limitations and rules. Not because there was room for what the Duskblade was in the game world itself. And this was despite the fact that the Gith and Gish thing happened because they deliberately created something within that space, knowing that it was a space that they had forbade. In order to make this seem like something that was in-world, they took special steps, which was super interesting, and I still hold on to them and use them in my own work. But there wasn't a place for them before, and that space had to be made because the rules had a problem that they sought to address with the application of this concept. which is kind of weird because they'd already done it, but they'd done it with a race. Always they could do it, but you couldn't because of the cultural understanding, and then the rules had to abide by that cultural understanding, even though something existed within the world that clearly showed that wasn't the case. So the Githyanki existing at all, people who want to have characters that don't fall within the predetermined purview of what a character type is supposed to be class-wise, are already metagaming. Because you're metagaming when you follow the rules, because the rules are not the world, right? You have to take a step back away from maligning that mode of thought and a step toward trying to deliberately think about what the world itself is like and what's going on in that world. And in order to do that, you have to be a game designer, right? You have to be designing your character in that world. It's not an easy thing to ask somebody to be able to do. The factotum is another example of a character type that could only exist because of the way that the rules were set up in the 3rd edition system. They don't have a place in the world. They're not a real thing. They are a side effect of the way the rules worked being taken advantage of in a particular way. I don't think you can find anybody that's going to try to explain what a factotum is as a playable character. But the Duskblade can be, because the Duskblade's role in the world is explained as being the way that certain kinds of elves in military situations dealt with armor and magic at the same time. So if your character is going to have a place in that secondary world, you have to be able to metagame when you look at what your character is. Maybe that's the takeaway from this, really, is what the role of metagaming really is in character design. Because what you're doing when you make a character is trying to figure out how to bridge the gap between the system that we use for the rules and the art persona, as I explained before. Basically, how does your character, through the rules, exist in the secondary world?